Imagine discovering, after an unexpected blackout, that you've lived for 20 years with a projectile lodged next to your motor cortex without ever suspecting it. In this story, we will explore the life of Dr. Carlos. From his childhood immersed in his parents' political struggle to the moment a CT scan revealed the bullet that had silently accompanied him. Join us as we relive his earliest memories, the siege of paramilitary violence, his upbringing with his grandparents, and the precision surgery that put an end to a 2-decade-long mystery. If you enjoy these stories, hit like, subscribe, and activate the notification bell. Don't miss out on more incredible tales like this. Let's begin! Carlos Calderon was 36 years old, but life in the emergency room had aged him prematurely. The gleam in his deep, serious eyes reflected the constant tension of the endless night shifts. An emergency room doctor at one of the city's largest hospitals, Carlos lived trapped between the chaos of emergencies and the monotonous routine of a job that never seemed to stop. Although his physique was athletic and he maintained the discipline of an athlete, something inside him seemed to be slowly giving way. Strongly built, his broad shoulders and firm hands, with long fingers, evident in his surgical skill, contrasted with the fatigue evident on his face. His dark brown hair, slightly disheveled from long hours at the hospital, was a reflection of his fast-paced life. The dark circles under his brown eyes were visible testimony to his exhaustion, but even so, he remained standing, always available for the next shift, always ready to save lives. Raised by his grandparents after losing his parents in a paramilitary attack when he was just a baby, Carlos had never had time to process many of the questions his past left unanswered. His childhood memories were vague and distorted, but one thing remained intact: the unconditional love of his grandparents, their safe haven in the midst of a world filled with chaos and violence. In his early years, little Carlos was swept away by the tragedy of losing his parents, political activists who, along with thousands of others, were fighting for change. Throughout his life, questions about that loss remained unanswered, but the pain never fully dissolved. Although his work in the emergency room gave him a clear purpose, deep down there was always something else he couldn't grasp. Life in the hospital, though exhausting, was also an opportunity to escape those shadows. Every case, every diagnosis, every life he saved kept him focused. But lately, something strange had started happening. The headaches he used to attribute to stress began to intensify. He thought it was just part of the burnout, something any ER doctor would overlook. But somehow, he knew there was more to the pain. Carlos was never a man of complaints, and the thought of giving up never crossed his mind. Life had been a constant battle since childhood, but his body and mind had always remained strong. However, those aches and pains began to grow stronger, like a slowly building internal pressure. One day, as he finished a particularly demanding shift, the pressure in his head became so intense that, as he got into the car to head home, dizziness overtook him before he could react. He dropped the steering wheel in his hands, and the next thing he remembered was the sound of the emergency siren, the beeping of the monitor becoming the marker of his last conscious memory. Carlos woke up on a stretcher in the emergency room, with the buzzing of monitors around him and the white light of fluorescent lights illuminating the space. He had no idea how much time had passed since the dizziness had hit him hard and made him lose control of the car. The first thing he felt was a stabbing pain in his head, the same pain he'd been ignoring for weeks. Despite the confusion, the hospital environment was familiar. The faces of his colleagues, the distant screams of patients, and the rush to get to the next shift. All of it was part of his daily life. "Carlos, are you okay?" asked Lucia, one of the nurses on duty, as she took his blood pressure. The concern on her face was evident, but Carlos tried to reassure her with a smile, something he'd learned to do in moments like these. "I'm fine, Lucia," he replied hoarsely, trying to sit up, even though the dizziness was still present. "It was just a bit dizzy. It's nothing serious." Lucia looked at him with a look that didn't hide her doubt. It was obvious something wasn't right, but Carlos didn't want anyone to be alarmed. He had always been that way, avoiding showing weakness in front of others. After all, who could understand the pressure of an emergency room doctor better than another emergency room doctor? "I'm going to ask you for a CT scan, just in case," Lucia said firmly, but he interrupted her. "No need," Carlos replied, trying to raise his hand in a gesture of reassurance. "I just need some rest and some pills. This is just stress, as always." Lucia hesitated for a moment, but finally nodded. She knew it was difficult to get Carlos to take anything seriously when it came to his health. He always attributed everything to the workload, the constant exhaustion, the endless sleepless nights. In his mind, the headaches were just a temporary ailment, something he could resolve with simple rest and painkillers. A few hours later, back in his apartment, Carlos lay back on the couch, the ibuprofen he'd taken beginning to take effect. The pain in his head subsided, but the feeling of pressure lingered, like a heavy cloud over his mind. He decided to ignore it once more. After all, what doctor didn't go through this? Life in the ER was a constant race, and he just had to keep going. As he settled in, he began to think about the past few days. The intensity of the emergency room, the accelerated pace, the ever-increasing number of patients. Sometimes, he felt his body craving more rest, but he couldn't allow it. He couldn't let anything interfere with his work, not even the discomfort he felt day after day. The life of an emergency room doctor, he thought, was like that: sacrifice, resilience, and a constant neglect of his own needs. But even if he ignored it, something inside him knew he couldn't go on like this forever. The small signs in his body, the constant aches, the unexplained dizziness, they couldn't just be part of the job. There was something else. The next day began like any other. Carlos woke up early, got ready for his shift at the hospital, and left his apartment following his usual routine. However, something was still nagging at his mind. The headache, although lessened by the pills, wasn't completely gone. The feeling of pressure was still there, constant, but he ignored it. As always, upon arriving at the hospital, the tension of the place immediately enveloped him. The hallways were bustling with activity, the sound of automatic doors opening and closing, the voices of patients and medical staff. Everything blended into a frenetic symphony of the emergency room. Carlos quickly headed to his station, where the team was already waiting for him to begin the day. The first case of the day was a young man who had a motorcycle accident. Carlos treated that patient and many others throughout the day, as he always did, without pausing for a minute to think about himself. Each emergency seemed more urgent than the last, and the adrenaline of the job kept him focused. However, something in his body told him he could no longer ignore the symptoms. As the day progressed, the dizziness became more frequent. Every time he moved quickly from side to side, he felt the pressure in his head increase. His vision blurred slightly, and his balance began to fail. But, determined not to show any signs of weakness, he simply kept going. By the end of the day, he felt exhausted, but no more so than usual. The usual tiredness was a part of his life. That night, after a particularly long shift, Carlos headed to his car, feeling the same heaviness in his head. Although he'd been through this before, something inside told him things weren't right. As he drove home, the pressure intensified, and just when he thought he'd make it safely, the dizziness hit him again. This time it was stronger, and his eyes blurred as the steering wheel slipped from his hands. He tried to react, but the world started spinning before he could do anything. The last image he saw before losing consciousness was the headlights of a truck approaching rapidly. When he came to, he was back in the hospital, this time in an emergency room bed. His head hurt terribly, and the dizziness seemed unrelenting. The monitors around him showed normal vital signs, but he knew something wasn't right. The feeling was the same as before, only more intense. "Carlos, are you awake?" Lucia's voice brought him out of his thoughts. Seeing her, he realized he'd been rushed back to the hospital. Lucia approached with a worried expression. "You fainted while driving. This time we're going to do a CT scan. Something's not right, and we need to know what's going on." Carlos nodded, acknowledging that, for the first time in a long time, he could no longer ignore what was happening. Lucia's concern made his stomach clench. Perhaps, finally, it was time to face what was really going on inside his body. The morning after his fainting spell, Carlos woke up with a feeling of confusion he'd never experienced before. The pain in his head was sharp, much stronger than the mild headaches he normally attributed to exhaustion. The dizziness continued, like a growing pressure that intensified with every movement. Although he was in his apartment, the sound of traffic outside the window and the distant ringing of the hospital bells seemed to merge into a kind of echo only he could hear. Carlos tried to convince himself it was just stress, that his mind was overloaded by the constant pressure of work. Still, the dizziness persisted, and the feeling of weakness in his legs forced him to take a longer break than usual before leaving for work. His head spun as he walked to his car, but he didn't let it stop him. The truth, he told himself, was that he couldn't afford to stop. When he arrived at the hospital, activity was as frantic as ever. The emergency room doors opened and closed continuously. Telephones rang in every direction, and patients' voices filled the air. Despite being surrounded by chaos, Carlos remained focused, treating each patient with the same speed and precision he always had. But inside him, something was changing. His mind remained alert, but his body was beginning to show signs of resistance. Throughout the day, the dizziness intensified. Every time she bent down or stood up to care for another patient, she felt like the world was spinning around her and the pressure in her head increased. Her vision would blur momentarily, and her palpitations felt more intense. She tried to ignore it, continuing with her day as if nothing were happening. But increasingly, she noticed that the accumulated fatigue was more than physical. There was something else, something she couldn't dismiss. At lunch, Lucia found him in the break room, his head resting on the table. Although he tried to hide it, his expression gave him away. "Carlos, are you okay?" she asked, approaching with a worried look. He raised his head slowly, trying to smile, but the grimace of pain was evident. "I'm just a little tired," he replied, trying to downplay it. "Don't worry. I just need a little rest." Lucia didn't believe him, but decided not to insist. She knew what he was like, a man of few words when it came to his health. But deep down, something in his demeanor made her think this wasn't as simple as what Carlos was telling her. The day continued, but Carlos's symptoms didn't improve. Every time he tried to concentrate on something, he felt the dizziness intensify and his mind become foggy. By the end of the day, the feeling of pressure in his head was so strong that he had to take a break. He leaned against the hallway wall, breathing deeply to try to calm himself, but the fatigue and dizziness were uncontrollable. When he tried to walk again, he stumbled slightly, and it was only thanks to the support of a nurse that he didn't fall. "Carlos, you should go home and rest," said the nurse, who had seen him staggering. He nodded, feeling a growing discomfort that his body wasn't responding as it had before. He quickly said goodbye to his companions and headed to his car. As he drove, the pressure in his head didn't go away. He thought the next day would be better, that he just needed to sleep to recover. But deep down, something told him there was more to it all. Carlos woke up to the sun gently filtering through the curtains. The usual sounds of the city crept into his apartment, but the feeling in his head was different. Today, the pain was more persistent. The pressure in his skull followed him like an invisible weight, a dense fog that accumulated in his mind and didn't disperse with the simple passage of time. Despite the accumulated fatigue and discomfort, She tried to get out of bed. She headed to the bathroom, but when she looked in the mirror, she noticed how pale her face looked. Still, she forced herself to stick to her routine. The initial symptoms, she thought, always passed. She attributed her tiredness to the constant workload, the endless hours in emergency rooms, and the unstoppable pace that life imposed on her. Her head spun as she dressed, but she attributed it to lack of rest and stress. During breakfast, he tried to concentrate on the newspaper, but the words seemed to move strangely on the page, as if they were blurring as he read them. Although the coffee woke him up a bit, the feeling of disorientation persisted. He decided to ignore it again, and got in the car to head to the hospital. The day passed between calls, emergencies, and more emergencies. However, the dizziness increased. Every time he bent down to care for a patient, he felt as if the world was spinning around him. In one such moment, after helping a patient with a fracture, he had to take a break. He leaned against the hallway wall, trying to make the dizziness pass. He found it difficult to concentrate. His colleagues looked at him, but he, as always, remained calm, maintaining his composure. The pain wasn't new, but this time it felt stronger, as if something wasn't right. He was so used to stress, to exhaustion, but this time it wasn't the same. Something else was happening. He wondered if perhaps, finally, the weight of years of accumulated work was taking its toll. But when the next case called immediately, a young man in critical condition with serious injuries following a traffic accident, Carlos immersed himself in work, disregarding his own discomfort. Somehow, emergencies kept him focused. As he performed the first intervention, his concentration took over, and the pain in his head momentarily faded. It was as if his body shut down completely in those moments of maximum tension. Throughout the day, however, the pain didn't subside. It was like a constant pressure that accompanied him. In the afternoon, after a particularly long shift, Carlos felt exhausted beyond belief. The dizziness and headache seemed to have worsened, and for the first time, he began to wonder if he was truly being rational in continuing to ignore what was happening in his body. The fatigue became unbearable. At the end of the day, Carlos found himself standing in the break room, staring at his reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing his own face. His normally confident eyes looked dull. The constant pressure in his head had evolved into a stabbing pain, as if something were pressing against his skull. Even his neck, tense from resisting so much, began to feel stiff. He knew something wasn't right, but he had ignored it all day, focusing on work and his patients. Lucia leaned closer as Carlos ran his hands over his face, trying to clear the mental fog surrounding him. As always, she noticed what he was trying to hide. "Carlos, are you okay?" she asked bluntly. The concern was evident in her voice. He tried to smile, but it was a forced smile, and Lucia wasn't fooled. "I'm fine, Lucia. Just a little exhausted. Don't worry. It's just all the accumulated stress." "You say that all the time," Lucia replied in a firmer tone. "This time you don't look well. You're going to go home and rest. And if you don't, I'm going to send you for a CT scan. This is the last time I'll let you say, 'Everything's fine,' when you look like that." Carlos looked at her, surprised by the seriousness in her voice. He knew Lucia was right, but something inside him resisted. He didn't want to be weak. Life in the ER was a constant challenge, and he felt compelled to keep going, no matter how exhausted he was. "I'm going to rest," he finally replied after a pause. "But a CT scan isn't necessary. It's just tiredness." However, Lucia didn't give up. She picked up her phone and began texting the radiology team. Carlos sighed. He knew Lucia wasn't going to let him go until he did what she thought was right. For a moment, he felt a surge of frustration, but he knew he couldn't keep ignoring the signs. With his head still pounding and his dizziness increasing, Carlos left the hospital and headed to his apartment. where the stillness of his home seemed to contradict the chaos he was used to. Upon arrival, he threw himself down on the couch, but even the silence offered him no solace. The feeling of pressure remained there, constant, like a shadow clinging to his mind. He decided it would be best to get some sleep. Maybe when he woke up, all of that would dissipate. But as he closed his eyes, something inside him told him he couldn't continue ignoring what was happening. There was something else he didn't understand, something else he couldn't let go of. Dawn arrived without bringing any comfort to Carlos. He had tried to sleep, but the persistent pain in his head and constant dizziness kept him restless in his bed. He got up early, almost instinctively, so as not to waste any more time. He needed some normalcy amid the chaos he felt inside his body. The rays of sunlight streamed in through the window, but they failed to dispel the mental fog that enveloped him. Carlos prepared for another day at the hospital, but when he looked in the mirror, he realized something he hadn't noticed in recent weeks. His face was paler, as if the vitality it usually reflected was no longer there. He tried to smooth his dark brown hair, but the sight made him feel strange, almost as if he weren't himself. The same exhaustion and pressure in his head persisted, and his mind was beginning to wonder if it was all just stress. The hospital was in complete chaos when he arrived. The intensity of the day began to take hold. A traffic accident, a cardiac arrest, a child with a high fever. Patients arrived non-stop, and Carlos treated them as always, quickly, precisely, and calmly. However, fatigue overcame him more than usual. Every time he bent down to care for a patient or ran from one room to another, the dizziness hit him harder. He felt the pressure on his head like an invisible barrier, growing heavier. In one such moment, while performing a suture on the leg of a newly admitted patient, the feeling of disorientation struck him again. His vision blurred for a moment, and he almost dropped the forceps. The nurse assisting him noticed immediately. "Carlos, are you okay?" she asked, looking at his worried face. Carlos took a deep breath, trying to regain control. He forced a smile. Yes, just a momentary dizziness," he replied, but his words sounded hollow even to him. The nurse looked at him suspiciously, but didn't insist. Carlos, however, knew he was at his limit. Somehow, he was aware that this wasn't normal. The dizziness, the persistent pain, the feeling that his body wasn't responding as it used to. Something had to be wrong. But what? That afternoon, after finishing her shift, she headed to the break room. She knew she had to rest, that she had to stop. But the first thing she did when she got to her locker was take out her phone and check Lucia's text. "Get a CT scan," she said. She knew the time had come. She couldn't continue ignoring what was happening. "Carlos, this isn't going to go away on its own," he said quietly as he grabbed his jacket. She decided to go to the hospital for a CT scan, even though she was secretly afraid. Not because of the test itself, but because of what it might reveal. She had spent so much time ignoring the symptoms, believing it was just stress, that now she was at a point where she couldn't turn back. What if the results were worse than she imagined? A CT scan was the definitive answer, and although he dreaded it, Carlos knew he had to do it. At least that way he could rule out any serious causes and move forward. But as he headed to the clinic, the weight on his chest increased. He was about to discover something that could change everything. The CT scan was scheduled quickly, as expected in a hospital like his. Despite everything he had experienced in his career, the feeling of being on the other side of the machine unsettled him. Carlos lay on the examination table, staring at the cold lights overhead while feeling the cold air of the machine hugging his skin. Somehow, being the patient made him feel vulnerable. It was as if all the control he had had for years, being on the patient's side and always being the one to provide answers, was now slipping away. The radiology technician prepared him for the scan, adjusting his head position and making sure he was completely still. Carlos tried to relax, but his nervousness wouldn't let him. A few minutes later, the machine began to emit a soft whirring noise as it rotated around his body, and the first image was taken. Then, with a slight movement, the table moved forward to allow for the next series of cuts. Carlos focused on his breathing, trying to calm himself. Despite the dizziness, fatigue, and pain, he didn't want anything to interfere with this procedure. He needed answers. He needed to know what was going on. The procedure was over in a few minutes, but Carlos couldn't stop thinking about the possible causes. Uncertainty surrounded him, but also a touch of fear. What would the doctors find in those images? He knew his health wasn't something to be taken lightly, but he was also aware that life in the ER had taught him to move forward without questioning too much. When the technician told him he could get up, Carlos didn't hesitate to leave the room and head to the waiting room. His anxiety increased with every passing second, and the thought of being alone in the room without knowing what he would find bothered him. He knew Lucia would be informed of the results, but just waiting made him more tense than usual. Shortly after, Lucia approached with the envelope containing the CT scan report. Her normally serene face displayed an expression Carlos couldn't immediately interpret. It was a mixture of concern and professionalism. "Carlos," Lucia said in a serious tone, "we need to talk about the results." Carlos, unable to help it, felt his breathing quicken. "What did we find?" he asked, trying to remain calm. Lucia opened the envelope and placed it on the table. The imaging results were projected on the conference room screen. The X-ray showed an unmistakable abnormality. A small but clearly visible metal fragment was embedded near her motor cortex. It was a clear, detailed image, and the location of the bullet was impossible to ignore. Tension rose in the air between them. Carlos remained silent for a long moment, staring at the screen. He knew what he was seeing, but he still couldn't fully comprehend it. This can't be right," he said quietly. He was still trying to process it. Lucia looked at him seriously, without taking her eyes off the screen. "Carlos, this is an image of something that's been there for a long time. It's not recent, which means you've probably been carrying this around for years without even knowing it." Carlos couldn't immediately process what he was hearing. A million questions flooded his mind. How was this possible? Why had he never noticed? Why had his symptoms not been detected before? The headache he'd been enduring, the dizziness, it all seemed to make sense now. But what he was seeing also raised a new question, a much more terrifying one. The bullet had been there for so long, and although his brain had learned to live with it, the risk was now greater than ever. "What does this mean?" Carlos asked, his voice tense, fear beginning to creep into his tone. Lucia sighed, without taking her eyes off the results. "Carlos, the bullet is near your motor cortex. This could have serious consequences if left untreated. What we don't know yet is how deeply it has affected your system. We need to make quick decisions." Carlos felt a wave of panic, but he tried to maintain control. He knew life had taught him not to give up, but this was different. Carlos remained silent, staring at the screen, the image of the bullet so clearly defined before him. The air in the room seemed to have cooled, and the reality of the situation began to sink deeply into his mind. He had never imagined something like this could happen to him. His mind, though trained to handle emergencies, didn't know how to deal with what he saw. His own body, his own brain, had been keeping this secret from him for years. Lucia, seeing his expression of disbelief, leaned closer. She knew what was going through Carlos's mind. The shock, the denial, the inability to process what it all meant. "Carlos," she said gently, "this isn't something you can ignore any longer. The potential damage it can cause is much greater if we don't address it soon." Carlos nodded slowly, still staring at the image on the screen. The bullet, a tiny metal fragment, was embedded near his motor cortex. The risk of paralysis, hemorrhage, or irreparable damage was present in every medical calculation Lucia and the radiology team made. And the worst part was that he had never known, had never noticed. How was it possible that something so serious had been there, inside him, all this time? "What do we do now?" Carlos finally asked, with a sigh that seemed to come from deep within him. Lucia stared at him, her face serious. "The first thing we need to do is assess the risk of surgery. Removing that bullet isn't easy. It's very close to critical areas. There's a high risk of paralysis if we're not careful. The decision to operate is yours, but we don't have much time." Carlos swallowed. The idea of surgery terrified him. In his career, he'd seen many patients undergo delicate operations, and some didn't survive, or ended up with aftereffects that changed their lives forever. But here he was, in the same position as many of the patients he'd treated. Vulnerable. His mind raced through options, but everything seemed so uncertain. He could choose to wait, live with a bullet inside his head, and deal with the dizziness, the pain, and the risk of something more serious happening later. Or he could undergo precision surgery, a high-risk operation, with the possibility that he might not wake up, or worse, that he might be paralyzed. The dilemma consumed him for a few minutes, but the adrenaline from his training as a doctor pushed him to face the situation. He had managed emergencies for years. He had made split-second decisions that changed lives. Now it was his turn to face the same uncertainty and do what he had learned to do. Choose. "Do whatever it takes," he finally said, his voice firm, despite the fear that still coursed through him. "I can't live with uncertainty. If this bullet poses a risk, I want it removed." Lucia looked at him respectfully. She knew Carlos was making a brave decision, not only as a doctor, but as a human being. She grabbed her phone and began coordinating the surgery with the surgical team, while Carlos remained in bed, his mind still processing what he had just decided. The idea of being on an operating table, surrounded by his own team, unnerved him. He'd saved lives, performed precision surgeries in high-pressure situations, but now he'd be the one under the knife. What if something went wrong? What if the bullet was there for a deeper reason? A vestige of his past he'd never fully understand. But one thing was clear. He couldn't continue living with this uncertainty. He couldn't continue allowing fear to control him. If there was one thing he'd learned from his years working in the emergency room, it was that fear only weakened people. News of the surgery spread quickly through the hospital. The same team that had worked alongside Carlos for years, that had witnessed his tireless dedication, was now preparing to operate on him. The situation was ironic, even for him. He had saved lives, performed procedures that tested his skill, and now he was the one who needed saving. The thought made him uncomfortable, but at the same time, it kept him steadfast in his decision. The surgical team was already underway. Lucia had summoned the best neurosurgeons for the operation. There was something strange about being on the other side of the knife, being the patient. But Carlos tried to push those thoughts away. What mattered now was that the bullet had to come out. The question was how. When he entered the operating room, the familiarity of the environment comforted him for a second. The cold lights, the whirring of the monitors, and the sound of sterile instruments being prepared for the procedure gave him a much-needed sense of control. Yet a part of him couldn't stop thinking about the risk. He was being operated on by the same team that had helped save so many lives. He himself had been part of those lives, that unbroken chain of doctors, nurses, and specialists. But now, the responsibility was his. Carlos lay back on the operating table and allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment. The pain in his head was still present, although somewhat relieved by the painkillers he'd been given. All he could do was trust his team and their experience, and perhaps his luck. Lucia was by his side, making sure everything was ready. Her presence was comforting, and despite the seriousness of the situation, Carlos could see the professionalism in his colleagues' every move. He knew they were in good hands. "Carlos, it's going to be a huge success. We've got you under control," Lucia said, her voice calm but determined. Although she was nervous for him, she didn't let it show. "I trust you," Carlos replied with a tight smile. He raised a weak hand, grateful not to have to make decisions right now. He'd already made the most important one. The anesthesiologists approached and began administering the sedative. Within minutes, Carlos felt his body relax and his mind slowly begin to cloud. Before sleep overtook him, one last image flashed through his mind. The faces of his grandparents, who had raised him with such love, and to whom he had never told the full truth about what had happened in his childhood. Darkness surrounded him, and the operation began. The operating room was immersed in an atmosphere of absolute concentration. The monitors beeped softly. The rhythm of controlled respirations was the only thing that broke the silence, and the surgical team's expert hands moved with precision. Carlos was under anesthesia, but his mind, still partially conscious, felt every vibration and whisper in the air. His body seemed suspended in limbo, conscious but inactive, awaiting the inevitable advance of the scalpel. Lucia, who had been their colleague for years, now led the operation, ensuring everything was perfectly coordinated. Meanwhile, the team moved with the calm that characterizes the best. Each one knew the weight of what was at stake. This wasn't just another operation, not just a patient. It was Carlos, a man who, like them, had been on the other side many times, but today he was the vulnerable one, the one at the mercy of others' decisions. "Let's start with the incision," Lucia said firmly, but her face reflected the seriousness of the moment. The access area had been prepared, and the first layer of skin was delicately separated, marking the beginning of a procedure that, in this case, was not only physical but also emotional. The team focused like a well-oiled clock. The rhythm of their movements was meticulous, as if each one were a step into the unknown. No one mentioned the idea of risk, although everyone felt it. The bullet was very close to the motor cortex, a delicate area of the brain that controlled motor functions. Even the slightest deviation could have serious consequences. The lead surgeon, Dr. Ramirez, began performing the craniectomy. The delicate action of cutting Carlos's skull with a surgical burr was a slow but precise process. The tool rotated silently, as if its presence was more of a warning than an action. The bone gave way easily, and within minutes, the neurosurgical team was ready to continue. Meanwhile, Lucia watched the screen with the data from Carlos's brain monitor. The information projected onto the brain mapping showed the real-time activity of his motor areas. Although Carlos was sedated, the team maintained constant monitoring of his motor function, ready for any necessary intervention. "Ready to get into the thick of it," Ramirez said, and with that simple comment, the tension rose. Lucia nodded, knowing the most complicated part was about to begin. The metal fragment was close to the motor cortex, a very specific area of the brain. For years, it had remained there without causing significant damage, but the risk that any failed intervention could trigger paralysis was high. The precision of this intervention would be determined by millimeters. While Ramirez began the process of extracting the bullet, the anesthesia team monitored Carlos's condition. The darkness he found himself in seemed to envelop him completely. Lucia's voice broke the silence again, calmly announcing the next steps. "We're going to use the microscope. We need a more precise view for the extraction." The procedure continued uninterrupted, and time seemed to become relative in that small, sterile space. Even though the risk of paralysis still loomed, there was a sense of control in the air. The patients who had passed through his hands were out of danger thanks to his team. Now, he could only trust them to save him. The scalpel was replaced with more precise tools. Every movement was observed under a high-resolution microscope. The bullet, which had remained intact for 2 decades, was about to be removed. The scalpel rested on the table, and in its place, Ramirez picked up a delicate micro-instrument, aiming for the metal fragment that remained embedded next to Carlos's motor cortex. The air in the operating room was thick with concentration. Every member of the team knew this moment would define their patient's future, and precision was crucial. The microscope image showed the tiny bullet, perfectly visible, almost like an intruder in Carlos's brain. "We're very close," Ramirez murmured, without taking his eyes off the surgical area. The microscope's light illuminated the brain area like a beacon, while his hands, steady and firm, continued the extraction. Lucia was at his side, closely observing the monitor that displayed Carlos's brain activity. Even though he was under anesthesia, her concern didn't disappear. The proximity to the motor cortex made every movement a gamble, every decision a question about the future of her friend and co-worker. "Keep the pressure as low as possible," Lucia said, adjusting the blood flow on the monitor. "We need everything to be stabilized for the final extraction." Carlos's heart was pounding, and the monitors confirmed it. Time passed, but the anxiety didn't diminish. There was a feeling in the air, palpable in each of them. The possibility of paralysis, of something going wrong, loomed over them. Their nerves were difficult to control, and, although none of them said it out loud, they knew the risk hadn't disappeared. Ramirez leaned close to the microscope screen, observing every detail. The bullet was embedded in a hard-to-reach layer, but he could sense the work was nearing completion. "Here it goes," he said finally, manipulating the microinstrument with the precision of years of experience. In an extremely delicate motion, he began to free the bullet from its position. The metal fragment, which had been there for 2 decades, slowly moved outward. The team, who hadn't dared to breathe freely, relaxed slightly as they saw the bullet beginning to give way. However, just when everything seemed to be going well, a slight change in the angle of the extraction caused a slight increase in bleeding to appear on the screen. "Bleeding!" the anesthesiologist exclaimed, his expression alarmed, as the numbers on the monitor began to fluctuate. Lucia reacted immediately, taking command with the speed that only someone with her experience could have. "Under the flow, we're going to stabilize it," he said firmly, directing the team with calculated precision. The pace of the operating room quickened as the anesthesiologists adjusted the level of sedation, and the neurosurgical team focused on stopping the bleeding with hemostatic agents. The moment of maximum tension passed, and the small surge of blood was quickly controlled. The bullet was now out of his brain. Ramirez held it in the forceps, looking at the small metallic object that had been inside Carlos for so long. The team, which had been holding its breath, finally exhaled. Although the risks hadn't disappeared, the operation had been a success. The bullet was out. Carlos slowly began to wake up. The fog of the anesthesia faded as his mind returned from the dark abyss of induced sleep. The first few minutes were confusing, a feeling of discomfort, assisted breathing still coming through a tube in his throat, and a constant beeping that seemed to come from everywhere. The cold of the recovery room enveloped him, and the first moments after the operation were like a thick fog that couldn't completely dissipate. Little by little, reality began to sink in. First, the pain, mild at first, began to creep into his head. It wasn't the same stabbing pain he'd felt before the surgery, but a more diffuse, more distant sensation, as if his brain were trying to adjust to a recent change. The constant buzzing of the vital signs monitor accompanied him, and he struggled to open his eyes. Beside him, Lucia was watching the monitors, with an expression that Carlos couldn't immediately read. "Carlos, can you hear me?" His voice came through the haze, clear and comforting. He knew he was awake, but waking up from anesthesia was always a difficult transition. Carlos tried to move his hand, but something stopped him. The discomfort was palpable, and that's when he noticed the pain in the side of his head. He was still struggling to process what had happened. Had it happened? Was the bullet out? His mind raced for answers, but sleep continued to weigh on him. The operation? He said in a raspy, barely audible voice, trying to get his brain to make the right connections. Lucia stared at him, observing that Carlos was beginning to regain consciousness. His face showed relief, but also a touch of tension. It wasn't the time to go into too much detail, but the answer to her question was already clear. The operation was a success, Carlos. The bullet is out. We did well, Lucia replied, with a slight smile that didn't quite hide all the tension she'd felt during the surgery. Carlos tried to process the information, but the dizziness still clouded his consciousness. The feeling of not knowing exactly what had happened during those long minutes while he was under anesthesia bothered him. His body, so accustomed to agility and speed, now felt strange, vulnerable. He was aware that he had been on the edge, on the brink of an abyss, and had survived. But now everything became uncertain, and a question began to arise in his mind. What would come after this? Is there any damage? Carlos asked in a whisper, dreading the answer. Even though he knew the surgery had been a success, he still felt that shadow of uncertainty. Was there anything else? Something the bullet had left behind? Lucia looked at him carefully, her expression indicating that she wanted to protect him from a more complex truth. No, there's no major damage. But you'll need more tests to be completely sure. We can't be 100% sure until everything heals properly. And the next few days will be crucial to know how your body reacts, Lucia replied, remaining calm, although something in her voice indicated there was more to come. Carlos nodded, speechless. His mind was cloudy, but a sense of relief began to sink in. The operation had gone well, and now his only challenge was waiting. But as so often in his career as a doctor, the recovery process could be long and fraught with uncertainty, and he, despite his apparent calm, couldn't help but feel vulnerable. Lucia watched him for a moment longer, assessing his condition, and then walked over to adjust the vital signs monitor. You're going to be fine, Carlos. You have a team supporting you, and your own reflexes and will to keep going are going to be the key to your recovery. You've already made it through the hardest part. Now we just have to wait. Carlos spent the first few days of his recovery in a private hospital room, surrounded by monitors that tracked his breathing and the stability of his vital signs. Although the first moments after surgery were relatively peaceful, the feeling of being limited, trapped in his own body, unsettled him. The anesthesia had worn off, and with it came waves of pain. His head ached intensely, a dull ache that didn't go away with painkillers. But the worst part wasn't the physical pain, but the uncertainty that haunted him. Hours passed, and Carlos began to feel more aware of his surroundings. Lucia came to check on him several times a day, checking his reflexes and the activity of his limbs. During each visit, Carlos tried to detect any difference in his own body, any sign that the bullet had caused deeper damage, something he couldn't yet see or understand. How are you feeling today? Lucia asked during one of his visits, sitting next to him as he reviewed the results of the latest tests. Carlos looked at her, trying to muster a smile, but his face felt rigid. Although the surgery had gone well, there was something inside him he couldn't calm. He knew time would tell if the after effects would be minimal, or if he'd have to face a long rehabilitation process. I'm better, although my head still hurts a lot, Carlos replied, rubbing his forehead. But what if something else can't be seen? What if the bullet has already left its mark on something that can't heal? Lucia looked at him with understanding, but also with firmness. Carlos, what concerns us most is motor function. I had a long conversation with the neurosurgical team. Although the bullet was close to critical areas, the surgery was precise. The tests from the first few days are positive, and the reflexes are working well. There doesn't appear to be any irreversible damage. Carlos nodded, but the doubt still lingered in his mind. He felt disconnected from his own body, as if he still couldn't believe a metal fragment had remained there for 20 years. In his most vulnerable moments, that thought haunted him, the question of why no one had noticed it before. He'd lived with that bullet inside his head and hadn't known. What else was there in his life he hadn't seen? What else had remained hidden? The hours passed slowly. The hospital continued its frantic pace, but Carlos found himself isolated in his own bubble of reflection. He felt alienated from the outside world, disconnected from everything he had been before. Every time he thought about what had happened, he felt something else changing inside him. The next day, Lucia informed him about a series of new tests they would perform to monitor his progress. The images from the surgery had been satisfactory, but they still had to wait a couple more days before confirming that everything was in order. Carlos, although relieved by Lucia's words, couldn't shake the feeling that the operation had been just one part of something much bigger, something that had been hidden in his life and was now beginning to surface. As the days passed, Carlos's recovery continued, albeit more slowly than he had expected. The headaches gradually subsided, but the feeling of discomfort persisted. Sometimes, he woke up with the impression that his body had not yet fully adapted to the surgery. His brain seemed to process every movement with a strange slowness, and a heaviness in his mind kept him tethered to an unsettling calm. Lucia had been carefully monitoring his vital signs and progress. Each time she visited, she asked him questions about his movements and motor function. Although Carlos was grateful for the care, something inside him didn't feel completely at peace. Not just the residual pain or the occasional dizziness, but the feeling that something was missing, something he still didn't understand. The fear that the operation hadn't been the definitive solution was beginning to take its toll on his mind. One afternoon, while Lucia was reviewing the results of the latest follow-up tests, Carlos sat up in bed, staring out the window at the empty hallway. Inside, the questions he'd kept buried began to surface. Questions that had been there his entire life, but now, after the operation, felt more urgent. The fainting spell that had landed him in the hospital, the discovery of the bullet, and his life up to that point all seemed like a chain of events that had led him to this very moment. But something didn't add up. He'd lived with that bullet in his head for 20 years without knowing it. How could this have been possible? Why hadn't anyone noticed it before? What was there in his past that, for some reason, had remained hidden? Carlos ran his hand over his face, frustrated. His mind leaped to the past, to his childhood, to the time he'd lost his parents. He vaguely remembered his grandparents' faces, the unconditional love they had always given him. But the memories were blurry, distorted, and the unanswered questions kept piling up. It was then that he realized something. The bullet had been there since his childhood, a projectile that had arrived when he was just a baby, the victim of a paramilitary attack that had changed his life forever. Suddenly, everything began to make sense, at least partially. That wound, so close to his motor cortex, could have been the result of that attack, which, in his memory, was only a distant echo. But how was it possible that no one had detected anything in those early years of his life? Carlos took a deep breath. If he'd learned anything during his years as a doctor, it was that he couldn't just dwell on doubts. He had to investigate. He had to find answers, not only for his own health, but for everything that had been left in the dark. His life, in some way, had been marked by that bullet. He'd suffered an invisible wound, and now was the time to unearth the truth behind that mark that had accompanied him for so long. He called Lucia, who had gone out to make other rounds, and met her on his way back. "Lucia," he began, his voice determined, though still laced with uncertainty, "I need to know more about what happened when I was a baby. My past. I need to investigate more about it. I need to understand how that bullet got there." Lucia looked at him curiously, but without surprise. She'd seen the determination in him before, and she knew that once Carlos got going on something, he couldn't stop until he found the answer. I understand, Carlos, but it won't be easy. Your past is full of shadows. What I know is that your grandparents always looked after you, and that the trauma was so great that no one investigated further at the time. But if you want to know more, you can start with the archives. There are records from those years, even if they're hard to find. Carlos nodded determinately. Despite everything he had experienced up to this point, the first step toward answers had been taken. Now he had to face his past, and perhaps, with this investigation, he could finally understand what had happened all those years ago. Carlos couldn't stop thinking about what Lucia had said. The words echoed in his mind. Your past is full of shadows. What exactly had happened in those early years of his life? Although his childhood memories were vague and distorted, there was something inside him that drove him to discover the truth, to unearth the lost pieces of his story. That same afternoon, while resting in his hospital room, he decided he couldn't wait any longer. With renewed determination, he picked up the phone and began searching for information. He called the few contacts he still had from his time as a medical resident. With luck, he might find something to guide him. Lucia had mentioned the archives, but Carlos didn't know where to start. Everything was so shrouded in mystery and pain that it seemed like dangerous territory, one that had remained unexplored for too long. The first call was to the children's clinic where he had been treated as a baby. The reception desk was distant, almost cold, but he managed to speak with one of the archivists who, after a few questions about his history, agreed to review them. At first, it seemed like there wouldn't be much information available, but something in the conversation made the woman reconsider her answer. I have access to the records from that period. While not much research was done during those days, I'm going to look a little deeper, the archivist said before hanging up. Carlos remained silent, listening to the echo of the telephone line. Every minute that passed, he felt as if he were digging into a part of himself he didn't want to remember. But he knew he couldn't go on living without those answers. Hours later, she received a call. The nervousness in her stomach grew when she saw the number on her phone. It was the archivist. I found something, she said without preamble. Your admission records are there. Your mother and father were identified as victims of an armed attack, and you, as a baby, were in the vehicle at the time of the shooting. The report mentions a bullet lodged in your skull, though no major intervention was performed at the time, given the chaos that prevailed during that time. Carlos swallowed, feeling a lump in his throat. Had the bullet been there so early? That tiny metal fragment had been a part of him since his first breath. And although he knew his parents had been political activists, the brutality of the violence that had marked his life ever since became more real. And what else does the report say? He asked, his voice calmer than he actually felt. The only thing they mention is that his case was treated as a minor wound. There weren't enough resources for more. They let it go. But in the final report, it's clear that no thorough examination was done. The bullet remained there, undetected. Carlos let out a breath of disbelief. The bullet had been a part of him for years, an invisible presence that had remained hidden in plain sight, while he lived his life without question. The thought of how his family's tragedy had been sealed in his body hit him hard. Memories of his mother and father, the few moments he shared with them, mingled with the painful revelation of the reality of his childhood. She hung up the phone, feeling the need to process what she had just discovered. She had grown up without knowing what had really happened to her. Her parents, political activists murdered in a brutal attack, had left behind not only a void, but a physical wound that had never healed. The revelation was both liberating and terrifying. He now knew what had happened, but also what had been hidden. The bullet that had been there for so long had not only caused him physical pain, but had also robbed him of something much deeper, a complete understanding of his own past. Carlos got out of bed and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights flickering in the darkness. In the distance, he heard the distant sound of sirens and the noise of life moving on. Somehow, that life of emergency and sacrifice, the life he had chosen, was the refuge that had kept him away from the most painful memories. But now, with the truth at his fingertips, he could no longer ignore what had happened. After the call, Carlos spent the next few days deep in thought. The image of the bullet lodged in his skull, and the revelation of his past haunted him every moment. He had lived his entire life without really knowing what had happened, without fully understanding the magnitude of the tragedy that had marked his existence from the beginning. Now everything fell into place, but at the same time, the pieces of his life seemed more disorganized than ever. She decided she couldn't afford to let the answers go unfinished. She had grown up without the truth, had lived under the shadow of a story she never understood. She couldn't continue ignoring what had happened to her parents, the paramilitary attack that had killed them, and her own survival. That bullet, that invisible presence inside her head, now had a much deeper meaning. It was no longer just a medical issue. It was an emotional wound, a wound that needed healing, not only physically, but also in her soul. Lucia had been his ally throughout this entire process, but now he felt he had to face this discovery on his own. He needed to find out more, to go beyond what the medical reports had shown him. He could no longer move forward without understanding the details of his past. He wanted to know more about the attack, the circumstances under which his parents had died, and how, despite everything, he had survived. In his free time at the hospital, Carlos began searching through the archives. He contacted several survivors of the paramilitary attack, some of whom he had treated in the past, unaware that their lives were connected by a common tragedy. Little by little, he pieced together the puzzle that had been empty for so long. He discovered that his parents, political activists committed to social struggle, had been murdered in cold blood during a paramilitary operation. It was a brutal attack in which several members of his community were killed. Carlos had been hit by a bullet while he was in the crib of his parents' vehicle, and although it was considered minor damage, no one realized that the bullet had lodged in his head. No further investigations were conducted at the time due to the urgency of the moment and the lack of resources. It was a collective tragedy, and the entire country experienced the loss. But no one imagined that the wound would remain alive in the mind and body of a child. Each discovery hurt more, but it also gave him a sense of closure. The pieces of his life were beginning to fit together, albeit with a harshness he wasn't prepared to face. He realized that, although he had been lovingly raised by his grandparents, the pain of his past had never completely disappeared. He had been living in a kind of disconnection, unable to understand why he always felt an inexplicable emptiness in his life. The day he finished reading the reports and speaking with witnesses, Carlos sat alone in his hospital room, staring out the window. The city continued on, but he felt his life had taken an irreversible turn. Not only had he survived delicate surgery, but he was now facing the truth of his story, a story marked by violence, pain, and survival. But it was also a story that, for the first time, he understood. What now? He asked himself softly, as if the sound of his words could give him back control over his life. Uncertainty about what would come after all this gripped him. How could he move forward with such a heavy emotional burden? Carlos looked at his reflection in the mirror before him. The man he saw there was no longer just the ER doctor, the man who had dedicated his life to saving others. He was a man marked by his past, but also by his will to move forward. He had been living with the hidden truth, but now he knew the only thing he could do was accept his story and find peace within it. The silence in Carlos's room was profound, and the weight of the newly discovered truth enveloped him completely. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains, but the surroundings seemed distant, as if everything were fading away around him. He had lived with the bullet in his head for so long, without knowing it. And now that everything had been revealed, he couldn't escape the echo of his past. Although the surgery had been a success, and his body was beginning to heal, the emotional burden of what he had discovered about his childhood kept him trapped in a whirlwind of thoughts and memories. He knew he couldn't continue without addressing what he had learned. The emptiness of losing his parents, the wounds of paramilitary violence, and the discomfort of living with a secret he never understood were eating him up inside. It was time to talk to his grandparents. For years, Carlos had seen his grandparents as his refuge, his family who had raised him with love and dedication. However, he now understood that they had also carried their own pain, the tragedy of losing their daughter and son-in-law, and of raising a child who bore the mark of that violence without fully understanding it. That night, after a long day of post-operative exams and tests, Carlos called his grandmother. The conversation was brief, but enough for her to know her grandson wanted to talk. It wasn't easy. She knew that by broaching the subject, she was opening a door that had remained closed for too long. But she could no longer avoid the truth. The next morning, when his grandparents arrived at the hospital, Carlos greeted them in his room with a serious expression, but also with a touch of vulnerability he didn't usually show. Many years had passed since they last sat down together to talk about those dark days. Time had softened the wounds, but the truth remained a shadow in their hearts. His grandmother, Maria, looked at him with affection, but also with concern. She knew something was different. Her grandson had changed, and not just because of the surgery. There was something else in his gaze, an intensity she hadn't seen before. "Carlos, what's wrong?" Maria asked gently, taking his hand. She knew that, sooner or later, this moment would come. Carlos took a deep breath before speaking. His words felt heavy, as if he were opening a wound that had never fully healed. "Grandma, there's something I need to understand, something I just discovered. The bullet in my head. It was there since I was a baby. I didn't realize it until now, but I was involved in the attack on my parents. They were killed, right?" Maria stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and love. Although Carlos had already suspected the truth, hearing it from her lips made him feel the rawness of what he had lost. His grandmother sighed deeply, as if the weight of all those years of silence had reached her at that very moment. "Yes, son, your parents were victims of a paramilitary attack. It wasn't something we wanted you to know, but we always knew you'd find out one day. It wasn't easy. We were so terrified, so broken, that we didn't know how to talk about it without it hurting you more. But it's the truth." Carlos swallowed, feeling a wave of conflicting emotions. Guilt, fear, anger, and sadness mingled in his chest, creating an impossible-to-undo knot. He didn't know if he felt relief or anguish at finally hearing the words he'd been searching for. "Why didn't they ever tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking, looking at her grandmother. Maria gripped his hand tighter, her gaze now filled with unshed tears. She knew that, in that moment, she was opening a wound that would never fully heal. "It was our way of protecting you. We wanted you to have a normal life, to grow up without the weight of what happened. But son, you always carried that weight inside you. We couldn't avoid it." Carlos closed his eyes for a moment, processing her words. He felt like something inside him was falling apart, but something was also beginning to rebuild. He finally understood why he'd always felt empty, why, despite his grandparents' love, there had always been a part of him that didn't fit. "I know things aren't easy right now, but I want you to know that we've always loved you, and we always will, no matter what. You're part of us, and you always will be," her grandmother said, her gaze filled with sweetness. Carlos looked at his grandmother, his grandfather, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel a little peace. Although the wound was still raw, there was now a reason behind everything. He understood that, despite the suffering, his life had a purpose and a story that defined him. He couldn't change the past, but he could begin to heal the scars it had left on his heart. After the conversation with his grandparents, Carlos spent the night tossing and turning in bed, his face buried in the pillow, his mind following a torrent of thoughts and emotions. Throughout his life, he had maintained an emotional shell, believing he had controlled his destiny, that he had managed pain above all else. But that conversation with his grandmother had broken down that barrier. Now he understood that the pain of his childhood, the violence he had been a victim of without even knowing it, had been a constant burden that had accompanied him every step of the way. Carlos realized that, although he had done everything possible to heal as a doctor, to care for others, he had never addressed the wounds he carried with him. Surgery had been only part of his recovery. Now he had to confront the emotional scars, the unanswered questions about his past, and above all, the meaning of the life he had led without fully understanding it. When he woke up, the feeling of disorientation was replaced by a strange calm. The anxiety, though still present, began to give way to the understanding that he was at a turning point. He had begun a healing process that, though painful, would finally allow him to understand who he was and why he had been scarred the way he had been. She decided she could no longer live with unanswered questions. She knew she had to delve deeper into her past. Her grandmother had given her a clue about the archives, about the paramilitary attack that had marked her life. She decided to investigate further, not only for her health, but out of a need to understand everything, to take control of her story. Not to rewrite it, but to accept it and heal. That afternoon, Carlos met with Lucia, his closest ally at the hospital, to discuss his recovery process and the research he had begun. Although Lucia was happy to see his physical improvement, there was something in her eyes that indicated she knew the fight wasn't over. The emotional challenge was still present, and it wouldn't be easy. "Carlos, I'm glad to see your recovery is progressing well, but how are you really feeling?" Lucia asked as she sat down across from him. Carlos leaned back in his chair, staring out the hospital window. The sun was beginning to set, dyeing the sky shades of orange and violet. Although the world around him continued at its frenetic pace, he felt like he was in a separate space, suspended between what he was and what he could become. "I feel like I'm starting to understand myself," she replied, her voice firm but heavy with suppressed emotion. "Now that I know what happened, it all makes sense. But I also realize that the operation wasn't the end. It's just the beginning of something much bigger. The bullet was inside me, yes, but so was the pain of what happened. My childhood, my past, all of it was there, and now I have to face it." Lucia stared at him, understanding the depth of what he was saying. "It's a difficult step, Carlos, but you have to know that you're not alone in this. You're surrounded by people who support you, and you have the capacity to heal. But the truth is, accepting your past, that's something only you can do." Carlos nodded, grateful for the support, but also knowing that the burden was his. He couldn't escape what had happened, but now he had the opportunity to shape his future, to find his own peace. He decided the first step would be to delve deeper into the archives. There was something else he could uncover, something that would connect him to his parents in a more tangible way. If he could understand the circumstances of the attack, perhaps he could understand the true reason behind his survival. Why him? Why had his body stored that bullet for so long without anyone noticing? The next morning, Carlos headed to the archives of the children's clinic where he was born. He knew the information he needed was there, hidden among yellowing papers and forgotten documents. The thought of facing what happened that day, of reading about the attack and his parents' deaths, terrified him. But he couldn't avoid it anymore. He needed to know everything. When he arrived at the archive, he met the same archivist who had helped him earlier. She looked at him sympathetically, knowing he was looking for difficult answers. After a few inquiries, She handed him an old file containing information about his family. Carlos opened the envelope with trembling hands. Glancing through the pages, he found what he was looking for: a detailed report of the paramilitary attack, including his parents' names and details of the ambush. It was written starkly, with words that described the brutality of what had happened. But there was something else too, something he still couldn't grasp. The document mentioned his name and how severely injured he had been. But the strangest thing was that there was little mention of the treatment he received, as if it had been a forgotten case among so many others. Carlos closed the file, the revelation hitting his chest like a cold draft. He knew what he was about to uncover wouldn't be easy, but now he had the pieces he needed to continue his search. The truth was there, waiting to be unearthed. Carlos spent hours in the archive, unraveling every page, every report. The sun had already set, and the warm afternoon light had given way to the cold artificial light of the library where he was. The silence in the space became his only companion as his eyes scanned the medical reports, the field doctor's notes, the references to the paramilitary attack that had marked his life. Every word written there felt like a revelation, a puzzle that was slowly beginning to take shape. What had begun as a simple operation to remove a bullet had become something much bigger. A search. Carlos was no longer focused only on the surgery, or the persistent dizziness or pain. He now understood that what had happened had affected not only his body, but everything he had been, everything that had been hidden from him. The bullet, his invisible wound, had been only a reflection of the much deeper wound in his soul. In one of the reports, he found something that gave him pause. The attack had occurred in a rural area, in a village where his parents were organizing a protest against the paramilitary forces. There were details about how government forces and paramilitaries had ambushed them, and how his family had been caught in the crossfire. Carlos read carefully how his mother, before dying, had tried to protect him, holding him in her arms as gunfire rained down around them. The written words intertwined with the image of his parents he'd always had in his mind. Strong, determined people, fighting for something they believed in. There was something deeply moving about knowing that his mother had done everything she could to protect him. But he also felt a painful frustration at seeing that protection had been in vain. What would his life have been like if his parents had survived? What would his childhood have been like if he hadn't been marked by tragedy from the start? Carlos closed the file with trembling hands, his breathing ragged. He was exhausted, but he also felt a new clarity wash over him. Despite the cruelty of what he had read, he now felt the pieces of his life beginning to fall into place. His life had been marked by pain, by loss, but also by a will to survive, to move forward. His parents had given him that drive without even knowing it. He placed the file on the table and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling of the small archive room. In those moments, the peace he had long sought dawned. He could no longer ignore what had happened, but he also couldn't allow it to completely define him. Now he had the opportunity to decide how to move forward. His phone vibrated, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Lucia. "Carlos, how's the investigation going? I want you to know that you're not alone in this. If you need to talk or need help processing what you found, I'm here for you." Lucia's words made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: support. He had been alone for much of his life, not by choice, but because of the way circumstances had pushed him. But now, upon receiving her message, he felt like something had changed. He was no longer alone in his struggle to understand his life, to find peace with what had happened. Carlos responded quickly. "Thank you, Lucia. I think I'm starting to understand what happened. And I know this isn't going to be easy, but I have to move forward. I can't stay stuck in the past. The surgery was just the beginning." He put away his phone and stood up, determined to move forward. He knew what he'd found in the files was just the beginning. There was something more he needed to do. He had to confront his story, not just as a victim, but as someone who was taking control of his life. While the bullet had been a part of him for years, now he could decide how to use that experience, how to make it part of his growth. The search for answers wasn't over. But now, Carlos had a new clarity. It was time to heal, to find his purpose, to live without the burden of the past, to be the man he was born to be, not the man scarred by tragedy. Carlos walked down the hospital hallway with a slight sense of purpose, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Although his body still felt drained from the surgery and recovery, his mind was clearer than ever. The weight of the past, the shadow of the tragedy that had haunted him his entire life, was beginning to dissipate. Although he knew he couldn't erase what had happened, he was determined to move forward, to rebuild his life with a new perspective. The pain in his head, though persistent, no longer dominated his life. Each day seemed like a small step toward healing, both physically and emotionally. The process wouldn't be quick or easy, but for the first time, Carlos felt the path to inner peace lay before him. He was no longer running from his memories, but beginning to integrate them into his life, accepting his story not as a burden, but as a fundamental part of who he was. Lucia approached him in the hallway, her expression kind but serious, as she always did when she wanted to make sure he was okay. She had been more than a colleague throughout this time. She was his friend, and her support had been vital during these difficult times. "Carlos," she said softly, "how are you feeling today?" Carlos looked at her with a slight smile, something he hadn't shown in days. The intensity of his gaze had changed, and his voice, though calm, now carried a tone of hope. "I feel better. I'm understanding a lot of things, Lucia. What happened, what I've been through. I'm ready to move on." Lucia watched him with a mixture of relief and pride. She had seen how Carlos, always so dedicated and serious about his work, had begun to process what he had been carrying all this time. She knew that, although there was still much to do, this was an important step. The acceptance of his story, the beginning of his emotional recovery, was a triumph in itself. "That makes me very happy," Lucia replied, placing a loving hand on his shoulder. "But I also know that what you're facing now isn't easy. You don't have to do it all alone, Carlos. If you ever need to talk, or if you feel like something's weighing on you, I'm here." Carlos nodded, grateful for her support, but he knew the real battle would be his own. He had to come to terms with his past, face the shadows that had lingered for so long. But now he knew he had the tools to do it. Over the next few days, Carlos spent time talking with several of the survivors of the paramilitary attack that had affected his family. Each conversation was another piece that fit into his story, but it also gave him a more complete picture of what had really happened that fateful night. Although it could never fill the void of losing his parents, the stories of those who had survived provided him with a sense of belonging, a connection to people who shared his pain. It was during one of these conversations with a woman who had been present during the attack that Carlos heard something that made him stop. She told him about his mother's bravery, how she had fought to protect him, and how his father, before dying, had tried to give them a chance to escape. That story, so vivid and charged with emotion, made him feel a deep connection with them, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if, for the first time, he could see his parents not just as victims of violence, but as people who fought for something they believed in until the very end. Carlos realized that although the pain would never completely disappear, he could now carry that memory with him in a different way. It wasn't just a wound, it was a legacy, and he, as a doctor, as a human being, could honor that legacy by living a full life, by healing the way he knew how. Not just by healing bodies, but also by understanding the emotional scars that people, including him, carried with them. One afternoon, after a long day, Carlos sat by his window, looking out at the city that never stopped. In the distance, The sounds of traffic and lights flickering in the darkness seemed to remind him that life went on. But now he felt he had taken control of his destiny. He was no longer trapped in the pain of the past. Instead, he carried it with him as a part of who he was. He decided that, beyond his work as a doctor, beyond surgery and recovery, his mission was to continue helping others heal. He had been on the side of pain for so long, but now he knew what it was like to be on the path to healing. And, on that path, he would help others find their own answers, just as he had. Carlos had taken a significant step on his path to healing, but now he faced the most important question. What did he want to do with his life from now on? The answers weren't clear, but the peace he had begun to find within himself gave him a solid foundation upon which to build what was next. He knew he could no longer continue living alone as the emergency room doctor who saved lives without considering his own. He wanted something more, something beyond the operation, beyond the blood and the rush. He wanted a life where, finally, he could integrate everything he had been, everything he had learned. The hospital had been his refuge for so long, but now he felt like he no longer quite fit in there. He knew he could still continue working there, helping others, but he also knew he needed space for himself to fully heal. The thought of continuing to deal with the constant chaos of the emergency room was exhausting, especially when he now understood how fragile life could be. He had experienced death up close, and he felt he needed to live more mindfully. Carlos had decided to talk to Lucia once more, not just as a colleague, but as a friend. He needed to share his thoughts with someone he trusted, someone who understood what he'd been going through. That afternoon, he found her in the hospital cafeteria, reviewing some files while sipping a coffee. He walked over with a firm stride and sat down across from her, not saying a word for a moment, simply staring at the cup in front of him. "How are you, Carlos?" Lucia asked, looking up and smiling, as if she could read his mind. There was something different about him. The intensity in his gaze gave it away. Carlos took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I'm fine, calmer, I think," he said finally. His voice, though calm, carried a reflective tone. "But I also know something has to change. I want to change, Lucia. I can't continue with the same routine, trapped between emergencies, without having time to think about what I really want to do with my life." Lucia looked at him, nodding in understanding. "What exactly do you mean?" she asked gently, without pressing him. She knew Carlos needed time to articulate his thoughts. Carlos leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table, searching for the right words. "I've spent years running, trying to save lives, but I haven't stopped to think about my own. I haven't stopped to think about my own happiness, my own well-being. And now, after everything I've learned about my past, about my parents, about the bullet, I feel like I need to do something more meaningful, something that gives me meaning, something that isn't just tied to saving lives in the hospital, but is also related to my purpose as a human being." Lucia watched him closely, with an expression that indicated she understood exactly what he meant. "I understand you," Lucia said, her voice soft but firm. "You've been through a lot, Carlos, and it's normal to want something more, something beyond work and the daily stress. Maybe it's time to think about your future in a different way." Carlos nodded, feeling that he had finally articulated what was inside him. It was no longer just about the surgery, about his body healing. Now it was about healing in a deeper way, about finding a path that had a personal purpose. Although he still felt a strong connection to medicine and his work in the ER, he also felt he needed something more, something that would offer him peace, a balance between what he did for others and what he needed to do for himself. "You know, I've always wanted to provide more than just medical care. I've thought about helping people, but not just in a hospital. Maybe I could get involved in a project that would connect me with communities in a more direct way, helping people heal, but also understanding what they need beyond medicine. Lucia smiled, clearly happy to see Carlos so thoughtful and clear. That sounds like a great step. And I'm sure you do very well, Carlos. You've had such a difficult life. But despite everything, you still have so much to offer. Carlos smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude for his friend. The conversation gave him clarity, as if he could finally see the path he needed to follow. He no longer wanted to live only for work and emergencies. He wanted something more, something that would connect him more deeply to the world. Something that would allow him to heal not only bodies, but also souls. In the weeks that followed, Carlos began researching volunteer opportunities for social projects that combined his medical experience with his desire to help communities in need. He knew this path wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was the only path that would lead him to a more fulfilling life. Meanwhile, the city continued its frenetic pace, but Carlos no longer felt like he was just a spectator. He was ready to be an active part of his own destiny, to take control of his life. Although the pain and the past would always be with him, he could now see them as lessons, not burdens. Carlos began to more seriously investigate projects he could get involved in. His interest grew in initiatives that combined medicine with community work, those that sought to change people's living conditions beyond the hospital setting. After all, he had been an emergency room doctor for years, treating wounds, saving lives, but something inside him told him he could do more. He wanted to have a deeper impact, something that went beyond the hospital walls. She focused on organizations that worked with marginalized communities, especially in rural areas where medical care was limited. She knew that while medicine was crucial, access to basic resources and emotional support were equally important. She had seen people suffering throughout her career, but now she felt she could contribute to something bigger: prevention, access, and above all, holistic well-being. One afternoon, while reviewing some emails from organizations, Carlos received a message that caught his attention. It was from an NGO working in rural areas of his country, providing primary health care, but also focusing on mental health and social well-being. It was exactly what he had been looking for. After researching them further, he realized they didn't just need doctors. They needed leaders who could understand the emotional and social realities of communities, something he felt he could contribute. He decided to contact the NGO to learn more. In his email, he explained his story, his medical experience, and his desire to get involved in projects that united medicine and social welfare. There was something calling him to those communities, something inside him that drove him to stop being just a doctor and become an agent of change. The next day, he received a response. It was positive, but it also required a more in-depth interview. Carlos felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. He knew this would be a big step, a change in his life that would take him out of his comfort zone. But at the same time, he knew he'd made the right decision. This was what he'd been looking for. It was the purpose he needed. With the appointment scheduled, Carlos prepared for his first interview. In the days leading up to it, he went over his story again and again. How could he explain his desire to change his life, to leave behind the emergencies and chaos of the hospital, to help in a more profound way? How could he communicate the impact his parents and his own life had had on his worldview? It was difficult to put into words, but he knew the passion he felt for this cause was sincere and strong. The day of the interview arrived, and Carlos showed up with a mixture of anxiety and determination. The NGO welcomed him warmly, and the interview went much more smoothly than he had imagined. They talked about his medical experience, his personal history, and what had led him to want to make a change in his life. When Carlos explained how the surgery had made him reevaluate his life and purpose, how the discovery of his past had driven him to take action, the team members listened attentively. At the end of the interview, the NGO director offered him a job offer to join the team as a community health coordinator, working directly with the communities where the organization already had a presence. It was a position that would combine his medical experience with his desire to directly impact people's lives. Carlos accepted the offer without hesitation. He knew this was the beginning of a new chapter in his life. It wasn't just a job change, but a life change. What had begun as a search for answers through surgery had become a personal mission to help others on a much deeper level. That night, upon returning to his apartment, Carlos looked out the window once more, but this time with a sense of peace. He knew that healing his body was only part of his process. Now he was beginning a new path, one that would allow him to heal not only others, but also himself, by integrating his past into his future. Carlos's first day of work with the NGO was a mix of intense emotions. He had spent so much time focused on traditional medicine, working in the chaotic ER setting, that now, faced with a job that involved a more holistic and community-based approach, he felt that everything he had done up to that point had prepared him for this change. He would not only be a doctor, he would be a leader in the social and emotional transformation of the communities where he would work. The NGO team welcomed him warmly. There was something unique about the way they worked. They didn't just offer medical care, but also cared about people's holistic well-being, their mental health, their access to basic resources, and their social development. Carlos soon understood that medicine wasn't just about curing diseases, but about creating support networks, about restoring people's dignity, which the traditional healthcare system had often stripped away. His first destination was a rural community where the NGO had begun working a couple of years earlier. The place was far from the big cities, with dirt roads that became impassable during the rainy season. The houses were small and humble, many built with recycled materials, but the warmth of the people was what stood out most. There, Carlos encountered realities he had never imagined. People who, despite their poverty, supported each other, shared what little they had, and faced life with a resilience that deeply moved him. During the first few days, Carlos dedicated himself to getting to know the people, speaking with local leaders, and understanding the community's specific needs. As a doctor, his first step was to offer consultations, but he also organized workshops on preventative health, basic hygiene, and how to improve access to the resources already available to the community. However, what impacted him most were the conversations about mental health. In that community, as in many others, emotional health was a taboo topic. People didn't feel comfortable talking about their emotional struggles, the trauma many of them had experienced, the invisible wounds that had plagued them since childhood. Carlos organized a talk with a psychologist from the NGO, and at first, people were reluctant and distrustful. But as the psychologist began sharing stories of people who had overcome similar traumas, the atmosphere changed. Carlos realized something important at that moment. Emotional healing was just as vital as physical healing. People needed to feel heard. They needed to release the weight of their memories and traumas, something he himself had only recently learned to do. Over the weeks, Carlos felt more connected to the community. He wasn't just helping heal bodies, but in a way, he was helping heal broken spirits. He saw how families began to strengthen their bonds, how the community as a whole came together to face life's challenges. Medicine, in that context, became something much deeper than physical intervention. It was the act of building trust, of offering hope, of giving people back the opportunity to fully heal. The job wasn't without its challenges. There were days when Carlos felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was doing, by the number of people who needed help. And although his medical knowledge was invaluable, he realized that the most important thing wasn't just curing diseases, but teaching people how to take care of themselves, how to take control of their health holistically. One evening, while walking through the streets of the community, Carlos found an elderly woman sitting outside her house. She greeted him with a warm smile, and he approached to talk to her. The conversation was brief, but what she said left him thinking for a long time. "Thank you for what you do, young man," the woman said in a calm voice. "You don't just heal us, you give us hope." That's what we really need. Carlos felt those words touch him deeply. It wasn't just about the medical appointments or the diagnoses, but about the way he had unwittingly begun to become a beacon of hope for those people. As much as he gave to the community, there was something he also received from them. The lesson of resilience, the value of human connection, and the importance of healing from within. Every night, upon returning to his small room in the community, Carlos reviewed what he had done that day. The medical consultations, the workshops, the meetings with local leaders. But he also thought about what he had learned from others. The strength of people, the ability to move forward despite adversity. Now he understood that medicine was not just a physical act. It was an act of love, of empathy, of deep connection between human beings. Time in the community passed quickly, and with each day, Carlos felt more integrated into local life. As he became more involved with the families and individuals living in the area, he began to realize an urgent and still unmet need: access to advanced medical tests. Although the organization provided primary and preventative care, access to technologies like CT, computed axial tomography, was almost non-existent for the community's most vulnerable families. In many cases, people had to travel for hours, or even days, to reach a hospital where such essential tests could be performed. Carlos, with his medical experience and growing sense of responsibility toward the communities he served, thought of a solution. He had worked in many hospitals where testing was routine, but he knew how difficult it was for rural communities to access these services. He immediately realized that something as simple as a free health event could be a great opportunity to offer diagnostic services to those who truly needed them. There was a health center near the community, and although it didn't have the infrastructure for a CT scan, Carlos contacted the NGO and some of his medical colleagues. With their help, he came up with the idea of organizing a free health event focused on CT scans for the residents of the town and surrounding villages. The community was small, but the need was immense. The event offered general medical consultations, but the main service offered was CT scans to detect potential health problems people didn't know they had. Carlos carefully organized everything. Appointments were scheduled so that the villagers could access the tests in an organized manner, and the NGO's medical teams handled the logistics. The idea was simple but effective. Carlos knew that while the event might be just a step toward improving health in the region, it would be a start for the community to begin accessing quality medical services. Fear and mistrust of medical procedures used to be major barriers in rural areas. But Carlos was confident that this event could be a way to alleviate those fears and show them that medical care didn't have to be inaccessible or intimidating. On the day of the event, Carlos stood in front of the health center, watching as people began to arrive. Groups had been organized so people could wait comfortably, and everything was ready to begin. The air was thick with anticipation, and although the event was simple compared to the large health campaigns in cities, its significance for the community was immense. Carlos walked around the area, greeting people and offering words of encouragement. Seeing families arrive, parents worried about their children's health, and older adults who had never had the opportunity to undergo a diagnostic test, gave him a deep sense of satisfaction. He knew that, although he couldn't change the entire situation at once, this event meant something bigger. It was a symbol that healthcare could be an accessible right for all, not a privilege for a few. "Thank you for making this possible, Carlos," one of the volunteers told him as they prepared the last room for testing. Her face reflected the same satisfaction he felt. There was something special about seeing how community members, even the most skeptical, began to trust the process. The first patient was a woman in her 60s who had been experiencing persistent headaches for months, but couldn't afford to go to a larger clinic for a CT scan. When the procedure was over, Carlos saw her relieved and grateful face, knowing it had made a real difference in her life. The event continued all day, and although there were some logistical delays, everything went much better than expected. Carlos was not only providing access to advanced medical technology, but also building bridges with the community, demonstrating that comprehensive healthcare was more than just a service. It was an act of solidarity. The day of the event passed more quickly than Carlos had anticipated. The hours seemed to merge into a succession of consultations, tests, and moments of conversation with community members. When the last person left the CT scan room, fatigue was evident in his body, but the sense of accomplishment was indescribable. He had achieved what many thought was a dream, bringing advanced medical care to a community that desperately needed it. As the NGO's medical team began dismantling their equipment, Carlos stepped back, observing the bustling health center. The people who had participated in the event were beginning to leave, some with relieved looks, others hoping to receive their results soon. Children played in the courtyard, and adults exchanged words with the volunteers, some already making plans for future medical encounters. As the sun began to set, Carlos sat on one of the health center's benches, letting the calm envelop him. He felt at peace, but also thoughtful. The satisfaction from the event was profound, but a part of him also knew that this had only been a step. What would happen next? How could he continue to provide this kind of access to more people? Although the community had received what it needed, Carlos knew that resources were still limited. Access to advanced technology and comprehensive health services in rural areas remained a constant struggle. Lucia approached him as he was lost in thought, a smile on her face. "Carlos, how are you feeling?" she asked, looking around. Carlos turned to her, smiling with a mixture of tiredness and gratitude. "I'm exhausted, but I think this is the closest I've ever come to feeling like I'm actually doing what I want to do," he replied, looking at the families starting to leave. "Being able to help these people, give them access to something they wouldn't normally have. I feel like this is the kind of work I want to do." Lucia sat next to him, also looking out at the community. They both knew the event hadn't just been a series of medical exams. It was a reflection of the hope that existed in all those who, for the first time, felt that health shouldn't depend on how much money you had or how far you could travel. "You did well, Carlos," Lucia said sincerely. "You did more than organize a medical event. You gave this community the opportunity to see itself in a different way. Hope is a resource that isn't always measured in numbers, and today, you provided a lot of hope." Carlos nodded, feeling those words reach him deeply. Somehow, by helping others, he had also found a purpose beyond conventional medicine. It wasn't just about treating illnesses, but about giving people the tools and confidence to take care of themselves. Night fell slowly, and while Carlos and Lucia helped gather the last supplies, Carlos began planning what would come next. He knew this event wouldn't be the last, but he also understood he had to work on the sustainability of these initiatives. He needed to find ways to continue providing these services, to ensure the community didn't just rely on a one-off event, but had ongoing access to the medical tests and support they so desperately needed. The next day, while resting in his room, Carlos reflected on what he had accomplished. He had taken the first step toward a true transformation in the community, but he also knew his mission was far from over. This event, although successful, had shown him an important truth. He couldn't do everything alone. He needed more support, more resources, and more allies willing to change the rules of healthcare access. But, for the first time, Carlos didn't feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of the challenge. He knew that, with time, with more events, and with the support of his team, things could improve. The days following the free event were a whirlwind of activity for Carlos. Although the community continued to talk about the health event, he couldn't stop thinking about how to take the experience further. He had achieved something great, yes, but he had also seen the limitations of the system. The lack of resources, the insufficient infrastructure, the shortage of trained personnel. He knew that if he really wanted to make a lasting difference, he had to find a way to make these services accessible year-round. not just at one-off events. It was then that Carlos began seriously planning for the possibility of creating a support network that could connect residents of rural communities with the medical and technological resources they so desperately needed. He began investigating the feasibility of partnering with other NGOs, mobile clinics, and nearby hospitals that could collaborate on these efforts. He also considered how he could forge alliances with medical technology companies, hoping they might donate equipment or offer discounts in exchange for visibility and social responsibility. Carlos knew he needed to take concrete steps, but he also understood he couldn't do it alone. During a meeting with the NGO team, he outlined his ideas and asked for their help to begin designing a more structured program of free medical care. He proposed the creation of a mobile diagnostic clinic, which could travel from community to community offering CT scans, ultrasounds, and general medical consultations. While everyone agreed on the feasibility of the idea, they also knew it was an ambitious project that would require funding and logistical support. Meanwhile, Carlos also decided it was time to reach out to other organizations, including some medical universities that could offer internships or volunteers interested in helping in rural communities. He knew that continuing education and training in health were key to creating sustainable change, and universities could be a great ally in that process. At first, responses were slow, but over time, Carlos began to see doors opening. A small local hospital agreed to collaborate with the mobile clinic, and the nearest university expressed interest in providing medical students to volunteer. The NGO team, for its part, also pledged to help coordinate logistics, find the necessary funding, and create a registration system for the communities. As plans for the mobile clinic took shape, Carlos realized this was just the beginning of a larger effort. He knew what he was doing wouldn't change things immediately, but he also understood that the small steps he took, the relationships he built, and the resources he mobilized would add up over time. The free health events were just one piece of the puzzle. Creating an infrastructure that would help communities long-term would require a much broader approach. But Carlos no longer felt alone in that mission. Teamwork and the support of his network of colleagues kept him motivated. Over the next few months, the mobile clinic began to take shape. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional. Communities that had once been isolated and underserved could now access quality medical care, and most importantly, were being given the opportunity to prevent illness before it was too late. Carlos began to see the results on the faces of the people he served. The fear of diagnosis disappeared when patients knew they had access to the tools they needed to take care of their health. Carlos spent long hours organizing the mobile clinic routes, ensuring that volunteers were well-trained, that communities received the right information, and that families knew how to make the most of the services. As the project progressed, Carlos was not only contributing to people's physical well-being, but also helping to heal a part of himself. Every time he saw someone leave the mobile clinic with an early diagnosis and treatment plan, he felt like he was taking steps toward the peace he had been seeking for so long. One afternoon, while preparing for the next day's medical care in a neighboring village, Lucia visited him. Seeing the effort Carlos had put into the project, she couldn't help but smile. "Carlos," she said with a smile, "this is taking shape in an impressive way. The impact you've had on these communities is incredible. You've done more than many people ever dreamed of." Carlos, exhausted but full of gratitude, responded, "I wouldn't do it without this whole team, Lucia. And it's not just the work, it's seeing how people react, how empowered they feel. This is what gives me the strength to keep going. I know not everything will be solved overnight, but this is a start." Lucia looked at him in admiration, knowing that Carlos had finally found his true purpose. "This is just the beginning, Carlos. You have much more to do. And, most importantly, you found a path that not only changes the lives of others, but is also changing yours." The mobile clinic project had begun to show tangible results, but it also brought with it new challenges. Although the community responded positively, much remained to be done to ensure the project's sustainability. Access to medical equipment, transportation logistics, coordination with volunteers, and funding remained constant obstacles. Despite the progress, Carlos couldn't help but feel that the project was on a tightrope, suspended between success and uncertainty. In a meeting with the NGO team, they discussed how to optimize resources, get communities to take greater responsibility for organizing events, and seek more funding. The idea was not only to provide medical care, but also to educate people so they could take care of their health more autonomously. However, resources were still limited, and Carlos knew that if they didn't find a long-term solution, the impact of the mobile clinic could fade. The challenge of funding posed the biggest barrier. The NGO had reached some agreements with hospitals and universities, but much remained to be done to ensure the project's continuity. Carlos then decided to contact international health organizations and foundations that might be willing to support initiatives that provided medical care to the neediest communities. Although the process was long, a couple of months later, he received good news. An international foundation showed interest in the project and agreed to fund part of the mobile clinic's operating costs, which would allow the NGO to expand its services to more communities. The process of obtaining funding wasn't easy, but knowing they now had the resources to continue gave Carlos confidence that the project would not only survive, but thrive. Time passed, and the mobile clinic began to become a vital part of the community fabric. People who previously couldn't afford basic medical care now benefited from care that, for many, had been an unaffordable luxury. Each mobile clinic trip was an opportunity to change lives, to offer people a healthier future. Carlos, meanwhile, continued working tirelessly, but realized he also needed a break. The pressure of keeping the project running and the emotional burden of being the pillar of the initiative had exhausted him. He remembered what Lucia had told him. The most important thing is that you also take care of yourself. He knew he had to keep going, but he also understood that his personal healing couldn't be ignored. He began delegating more tasks to his team, looking for ways to balance his professional life with his emotional well-being. He wanted to continue helping, but not at the expense of his own health. The first step toward that balance was difficult, but necessary. Carlos decided to take a couple of weeks to rest and reflect. He couldn't continue being everyone's savior. He had to learn to take care of himself so he could continue helping others. During that time, Carlos devoted himself to reading, meditating, and hiking in the nearby mountains, seeking the peace he had been avoiding for so long. Upon his return, he felt renewed. Now, instead of leading alone, he began working more closely with his team, delegating responsibilities and supporting others to take on key roles. The project moved forward, and although the challenges didn't disappear, Carlos no longer faced them alone. He knew he had found something truly worthwhile, a purpose that not only gave his life meaning, but also transformed the lives of the people he touched. The mobile clinic continued to grow and expand, reaching more communities, and with each visit, Carlos felt more at peace with his role in the project. The experience had profoundly transformed him. He no longer saw himself as an isolated doctor in an emergency room. He now saw himself as part of a network of social change that was making a real difference in people's lives. One afternoon, while he was reviewing some reports and planning the mobile clinic's next trip, he received a message from Lucia. She had been closely following his progress and, as always, offered support. "Carlos, I'm so proud of you. You've accomplished so much and transformed so many people's lives. But I also want you to continue taking care of yourself. Remember, it's not just about what you do, but how you do it. You have a purpose, but you also deserve to enjoy it." Lucia's words echoed in his mind. He knew he couldn't continue giving of himself completely without taking care of himself. He'd learned that balance was key, and although he still had a lot to do, He'd found a way to give without losing himself in the process. Carlos spent the following weeks organizing a new phase of the project: the creation of community health centers where people could receive basic medical care, psychological consultations, and disease prevention guidance. These centers would be a cornerstone in each community the mobile clinic visited, serving as continuous access points to healthcare. At the end of the year, Carlos organized a celebration in the village where it all began. It was a simple affair, but filled with emotion. The community gathered to celebrate the progress and express gratitude for the work everyone had done together. Carlos stood on stage, looking into the faces of those he had helped, those who had helped him heal in turn. At that moment, Carlos realized something fundamental. Although his life had been marked by pain and tragedy, he was now building something that would endure. He had found his purpose, and with it, the peace he had been seeking for so long. If you've been inspired by Carlos's story and his transformation, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Give it a like and leave a comment telling us what you think, or if you have any questions. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Click the bell to not miss our future videos. Thank you for being part of this community and following us on this journey of improvement and hope. See you in the next video.